You've been in power now for 17 years. Only now, you say, is Africa pulling itself out of the dark age of what you call unreason, cruelty and irrationality. You blame the colonialists of Europe for the legacy. They left leaders like you in Africa. You complain that Africa is being dubbed no hope and a dark continent and is really being misrepresented by the international community. What do you, therefore, see happening now in your continent of Africa, particularly here in southern Africa?
Well, I see quite a lot happening. There has been a kind of transformation in the thinking of Africa, and a transformation that has been assisted to a very great extent by the thinking elsewhere in terms of concepts that should govern good society.
You complain very much of stereotypes, Mr. President, very much of stereotypes about Africa.
Yes.
Are you breaking those stereotypes?
Yes, I think so. I think we are. Having emerged from a system of colonialism, obviously, there was a limited scope, you know, that one found in a situation in which people were poor, and people had not had the legacy of democracy, and they had to make a fresh start. So now that fresh start has been made, and we know the mistakes that have been made also by the first generation of leaders, and those are being corrected along the way. There is talk of democracy everywhere, and thank heavens that talk has become internationalist talk throughout the world. And so what the world says in one part of the world is repeated elsewhere.
You complained particularly recently, and I'm quoting your words here, about the image of conflict, of violence, of even witchcraft, you've called it, disease, grinding poverty and hunger. That, you say, is the image still of Africa.
Yes.
How much is really changing in this part of the world?
Well, quite a lot has been changing. A lot has been done in various societies, and especially in what you might call emerging societies of Africa. And a lot has happened through education, through the creation of communities that are well united and that can now see the way things are going, and that are united in their efforts to bring about improvement in various ways, intellectually, improvement in terms of the lives of people as they are affected by good health, and eradication of disease, although we are still haunted by quite a number of maladies.
And poverty, too.
And poverty. Well, I'm not saying that all is now well, all is perfect. Mistakes are still being made in some areas. We still have dictatorships that must go, dictatorships that won't listen to the call for democracy, and which have got to be made to listen.
Which dictatorships do you believe should go in Africa?
Well, there are still dictatorships in Africa. I don't want to offend anyone, but I'm glad that there is so much pressure within countries, so much pressure from outside, and outside within Africa, outside of Africa, which all of these pressures go towards, obviously, influencing the individuals who are in these despotic positions to change their course.
Mr. President, how long, though, do you think you can keep blaming the past and the history of colonialism for the problems you now face, particularly the problems of the slave trade in the past and so on? Because you, after all, have been in power now for 17 years. Do you feel frustrated at the levers you've pulled and the problems you still see?
No, I'm not frustrated at all. I think I'm one of the happiest persons in Africa. But what one must never forget, now the effects of colonialism on you, we still have some vestiges of colonialism here and there. Our society is not perfect yet. There are people who still think in racial terms, like Ian Smith. He's in our midst, And recently he published a book, as it were, reiterating exactly what he used to do, what he desired, and this is still the kind of life he wants to live. But things have changed
but do you
for
believe
many
the
people.
whites in your country are still thinking in a colonial way? They're thinking forward, privatization and so on.
Yes, there's some of them are still thinking, not many, but there are others who are still thinking in that same Rhodesian way. In fact, there are Rhodi organized, groups that knit together and are responsible for part of the bad image that is portrayed abroad through propaganda. But really, the majority of the whites are forthcoming, especially the younger ones.
One of the things you are trying to introduce here is privatization.
Yes.
And your mantra, you keep saying, is privatization.
Mm-hmm.
But there are many complaints that I hear that from businessmen, they wish it would work much better. In other words, a sense that maybe you're not galvanizing it forward at the kind of speed you would like.
But when you talk of privatization in this country, really you're talking of just a small and insignificant area that is still controlled by government. And you're talking of a handful of parastatals. Privatization took place long ago in this country. We never nationalized a single industry in this country when we took over. But of course there are these parastatals. Most of them we inherited from Ian Smith. A few others we created ourselves. And it is those which people are talking about when they refer to our privatization program.
You in your 17 years have moved ahead very substantially on education and health. But still, there are many who are saying 17 years, there's still rising unemployment, there's still high inflation, there's still poverty which is rising, there's a rising of infant mortality, a feeling that really you haven't managed to achieve those great aspirations with which you came to power and which you were elected 17 years ago. Do you feel a sense of frustration that you haven't achieved what you would have liked to achieve so far?
I feel really, I have a sense of joy that we have achieved much more than we have not achieved. In other words, some of our goals have been achieved. Still others are yet to be achieved. It all boils down to the resources that are available. And the times haven't been good, as I said earlier on. We have had these successive droughts which have had an effect and a very serious impact on our programs, and we have had to reverse some of our programs, but many others were allowed to continue, were facilitated, and I want to say that there's been a greater achievement than failure, really. But having said that, I must admit that we have not been able to create the levels of employment that we set out to create. And that's why we came up with the economic reform program, which is now beginning to work.
One of the interesting things talking to you, Mr. President, is about what you think your paradigm, your model is now for a southern African state, both economically and politically. You came to power 17 years, having fought in the bush, having been through the Lancaster House negotiations. You came to power, freely elected, but your principles were Marxist. Now your party, ZANU-PF, several years ago, dropped the Marxist idea.
Right.
You generated the idea of what you called scientific socialism. With all this talk about private sector development here in your country of Zimbabwe, is there socialism here still? Or are you a different kind of president now?
True, we had to accept that change should come, and change in various ways. We had to revise our own ideology, and that was done in the party. And sadly, we had to shed off some of our Marxist apparel.
In your heart, do you still feel a Marxist?
In my heart, I feel a socialist. We were never Marxist to the extent that the Soviet Union was in our ideological beliefs. We didn't believe in regimentation, and we carried out no regimentation. We didn't believe in nationalization, and we carried out no nationalization in theory. In fact, we were more Marxist in theory than we were in practice. And so when time came for us to review the situation, including our ideology, we had this history of our performance, and we say to ourselves, yes, we have in theory been Marxist, but what Marxism have we practiced since 1980? Hardly any.
So self-criticism led you to
Yes,
that.
self-criticism. But we did accept that in regard to our socialist thrust, we had brought up the level of education, and there was now an education program that was accessible to every child. And in that regard, and also in regard to health, we had succeeded. But we hadn't succeeded in promoting industry and its development. And so let's open up, let's remove those brakes which prevented the expansion of industry, kept out investment, and that's how we did it. So on the one hand, we will be capitalistic in our thrust, but we have to retain a socialist thrust in regard to social services. And in regard to the poor we shall always have. And in regard to the development of the peasantry, and of course taking care of the people in times of hardships as in times of droughts.
But on the other hand, here are you talk time and time again about democracy. We have democracy here. Democracy is about the future of Southern Africa. In a sense, do you instinctively, Mr. President, wonder if actually a form of authoritarian democracy is what is going to generate economic development? Because after all, your party, ZANU-PF, has 147 of the 150 seats here.
Yes, sure. That is because, one, the people have continued to regard us as the party responsible for the new dispensation that they now have in the country by way of a free society, democracy, etc. Two, because of our unity. The two parties came together, and that then obviated the possibility of another party emerging in those circumstances as an opposition party. It will take time for an opposition party to grow here. But the divergence of views has started to show itself even within the party, and it's for the better. If at the end of the day you accept there is that divergence of viewpoint, and the various views are expressed, but as long as they end up through an acceptance that those whose view is preponderant carry the day, then there is nothing wrong with a divergence of viewpoints.
What do you say to those who say it's still very much an authoritarian system here, despite the way you always talk about democracy and pluralism?
I don't know what you call authoritarianism. The decisions of the party,
Virtually single party.
the decisions of the party, they find expression, obviously, in government through policies. And if you can call that authoritarianism, well, there it is. But how else do you do it?
Do you feel uncomfortable if there is an opposition? There is almost no opposition in this country.
No, I don't feel uncomfortable at all. And there is room for an opposition to grow. But unfortunately, there hasn't been people with real views you can call progressive, sufficiently progressive, more progressive than our own, which can command support. I take it, as time goes on, that's bound to happen. And when it does happen, you can't lament it has happened. It's the people who have wanted it. But having said that, may I say, we cherish our unity, and we believe that without unity, you can't succeed at all. and hence we would want to keep united as a people. We will always preach the gospel of unity, and that even those with different viewpoints should continue to hold that we have one destiny as a people. We must be tolerant. We must accept viewpoints that are opposed to our own, but at the end of the day, we have one flag, one national anthem, and therefore one goal as Zimbabwe.
But we speak at a moment when your party, ZANU-PF, appears to be having serious problems over the issue of the airport, when at the moment quite a large number of MPs are refusing to even adhere to the whip of your party to even come and discuss it in a caucus. Now, does this leave you, despite the fact you say there is unity, with a sense that something is now changing here within your party?
No, this has happened in the past. It's not happening for the first time. Sometimes really it happens because there is dereliction of duty. People do not take their tasks seriously, and you need the whip to whip them into.
But those who are criticising you at the moment say this is actually symptomatic of a more deep felt sense of social unrest now here.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't see any real basis for social unrest in a country like this. There is growth, and that growth is, the growth of the economy is translating itself now into higher incomes on the part of the people. There is business developing, new enterprises are coming up, and those which have existed all along are expanding, and there is greater employment every year now, rather than retrenchments which we experienced some 2-3 years ago.
Nevertheless, there are those political observers who are saying that something is happening within ZANU-PF, a sense that something is changing, particularly the anxiety there is over certain contracts which have been issued lately, and contracts which some people are now calling into question.
Well, it's good. It's good to call them into question when they don't see them being transparent.
Do you feel uneasy about some of these contracts and the way they've been awarded?
No, I don't at all. I think in some cases it's just wrong suspicions. I think they have been discussed. Well, first there is a tender board, and the tender board makes a decision, and the decision then comes to us. We look at it, we see whether it was fairly reached. If we see it was fairly reached, fine, the winner takes it. But there has been just one instance where we wanted tenders to establish what participants they were, but government had to take a decision, and a decision also in political terms. We have had participants from Europe, we have had participants from America in our economy. Let's give this one to a participant in Malaysia. That's the only area which some say has given concern, and they say there was no transparency. But
we're talking about the principles here of an economy, of politics, of governance.
Yes.
And you will be aware of some of the voices who express deep concern that there is a level of corruption which is now creeping in, which is actually potentially destabilizing the system you have set up. How do you see it, Mr. President, from your position? Do you accept that this is actually something which is now a serious problem for Zimbabwe or not?
I don't think it's as serious a problem as it is in some countries. But any corruption at any level is something we must fight against. And in Zimbabwe, it is in the area where persons are asked to be given something for them to perform what is really their duty to perform. If, for example, the police at a border post ask to be rewarded for performing their duty, and immigration officers, for him to issue a visa, asks for something, for a tip. That's wrong. And we
But I think we're talking about bigger deals here. We're talking about bigger deals, awarding of contracts, that kind of thing. A sense that the government is not necessarily as clean as it should be in this.
That I haven't heard about. Deals are awarded with the consent of government. And I do not know of a deal where government has received commission. There may be the tendency on the part of some of the contractors or those who participate in tenders,
on the government side as well.
To give commissions and talk to some influential person and tip them off. That perhaps has happened. We only go by suspicion and by what people say, but hearsay is not always the truth. But
do you feel comfortable with the idea of commissions to investigate this? Because there
has
been a hint that at times the government has backed away from commissions, fearful of what those commissions will uncover.
This is what the so-called opposition press says. There is nothing that we have fought away from or shied away from, and that needs investigation. There is reference, for example, to the issue of the war victims' compensation, and that people who should not have applied for it did apply for it. And we asked the Ministry of Public Service, Labour and Social Welfare to go into it. And they're going into it. They've produced a list, which I think does show precisely that yes, some people who should not have applied did apply, including some high-standing people in government.
Mr. President, we started off discussing today Africa. Could I return to Africa? We have had an extraordinary upheaval recently in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. What has this told you about the future of Africa and the future of people like Mr. Mobutu, President Mobutu, who tried to cling to power?
I've learned nothing. I've only seen the experience elsewhere being repeated in Zaire.
Is that a continuation of what you started here?
We did it here. They've done it in South Africa. They did it in Namibia. Did it in Mozambique and Angola. And what has happened in Zaire has only this difference, that the oppressor has been an indigenous person, is the Zairean, or Congolese if you want. But in our own situation, the persons were foreigners, and had been foreigners who had established themselves here.
Do you see now a new model emerging for these kind of nascent democracies, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Well, we see democracy being redefined in Africa, but of course the parameters have got to be the same, and there is no greater parameter than that any system of government must be an expression of the will of the people, and however the people are organized.
President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, thank you very much indeed for talking to us on Hard Talk. Thank you very much indeed.